right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm actually welcoming you from the HRC office for the first time this year, which is great. And I'm looking forward to welcoming you in person at some point this academic year. Welcome to the HRC series Meet VCU Authors. My name is Keena and I'm the director of the HRC. In partnership with VCU Libraries, our Meet VCU Author series invites members of the Richmond community as well as colleagues and students from VCU and other local universities to meet VCU authors as they talk about their recently published books and answer questions about their work. Although we still can meet in person, but soon, due to public health concerns, we look forward to recognizing our VCU authors in the College of Humanities and Sciences and beyond in this format before we can resume our talks in person. And as usual, I'd like to give a big shout out to Tyler Conrad, our Director of Events and Communications in the college, who is actually supporting us today from vacation and whose execution of HRC events from registration to videos this year has been truly remarkable. Tyler and the communications team in the college have been essential in ensuring that our robust programming continues as we strive to become a university-wide research center this year. Our speaker today is Professor Alex Keena, who is an assistant professor of political science and here at VCU, and who will share with us his most recent book called Gerrymandering the States, Partisanship, Race, and the Transformation of American Federalism, published this year by Cambridge University Press. And what a perfect timing of this talk a day before election. He will take about 40 minutes or so, right? And then we'll take questions from the audience. And as we usually do at these events, I'd like you to please post your questions in the Q&A function during the talk, and then we'll get to them in the order in which they are received. Dr. Alex Keena, for those of you who don't know him, is an assistant professor of political science who researches political representation. He is the author of the book I mentioned, as well as another book also published with Cambridge University Press in 2016 called Gerrymandering in America, the House of Representatives, the Supreme Court, and the Future of Popular Sovereignty. Besides co-authoring these two books, Dr. Keena is also the author of many articles on redistricting, money in politics, and the US Congress. Many of you may not know that he graduated from J. Sargent Reynolds Community College in 2008. He then completed his bachelor's degree at Loyola University in Chicago in 2011, and his PhD at the University of California, Irvine in 2016. Welcome to Meet VCU Authors, Professor Keena, and congratulations to you and your co-authors on the publication of your book.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Humanities Research Center for having me. I was going to talk about the book with one of my co-authors, Michael Latner, but unfortunately he's had a family emergency that he's dealing with. So Professor Latner won't be joining us today. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and today we're going to talk a little bit about America's most political activity, which is redistricting. And I'm not going to assume that everyone in attendance knows what redistricting is, so I'll just briefly talk a little bit about it. Redistricting is this thing that happens at least once every 10 years in the United States, where after all the people in the country are counted, every state is apportioned a certain number of seats in the House of Representatives, which has been going on ever since the founding 240 years ago. And then it's up to the states to split the number of seats they have into Congress into separate districts. In the United States, like, district-based representation is the norm, but it's actually kind of an anomaly when you look at how most developed democracies do this across the world. In the United States, we have this idea that local representation is a good, it's an end, And dividing people into districts based on their geography is how we achieve that norm. But in most other countries, they use either a combination of district-based representation and national level representation, and they use it using proportional representation systems. So there's all sorts of problems that come from the system that we have, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. In my first book, which was published when I was in grad school, my co-authors and I looked at how redistricting impacted representation in Congress. We looked at the 2011 redistricting cycle and found that nationwide, there was widespread partisan gerrymandering of the congressional lines. So in other words, state redistricting authorities were more or less drawing these lines in a way that gave one party a durable advantage above the other. And the bias was such that in the 2012 elections, even though Democratic candidates for the US House of Representatives won most of the vote nationwide, won more than Republicans, Republicans had a majority in Congress by several dozen seats. And what was interesting about the 2011 gerrymander, as opposed to other cycles where, of course, gerrymandering has existed for hundreds of years, is that the scope of bias was greater than we had seen ever before. And what has been borne out by this study is that these gerrymanders have been very durable. They're not self-correcting. They've lasted for, in many cases, over a decade. Our goal in 2016 with this book was to find a scientifically valid legal principle that could be used in the courts to challenge unlawful partisan gerrymandering. The fact that a political party was able to protect a majority of Congress without even a majority of the votes was very troubling to us. We wanted to be able to identify a standard that the courts would recognize as a standard that citizens across the country could use to challenge the maps that they had in their states. Ultimately, we failed in this task because a few years ago, the Supreme Court, in a landmark decision, Roucho v. Common Cause in 2019, held that partisan gerrymandering is not a problem that the courts are capable of providing relief for. Essentially, the court said that, yes, we recognize that partisan gerrymandering harms individuals and deprives them of their constitutional rights, but we're not capable of providing any solution to the problem of partisan gerrymandering. Instead, you have to go out to your state governments and you have to vote for parties that will promise to reform redistricting. Of course, this is kind of a stupid solution because it strikes at the very heart of what redistricting is and what gerrymandering is. If elections are not responsive to public will, then of course elections are not a solution to the problem of rigged elections. Nevertheless, we thought that this was an opportunity to sort of recalibrate the scientific literature, because in the wake of the 2011 redistricting and gerrymandering of Congress, it received a lot of press and a lot of academic interest. And the bulk of the research in redistricting was really oriented towards battling gerrymandering in the courts. And in 2019, the court slammed the door on that, the Roberts-led court. And so you have like 7 years of scientific research that overnight is like obsolete. And we decided we wanted to contribute to this literature to provide a way forward after this huge defeat. And so we wrote the current volume that we have that's just been published with Cambridge, Gerrymandering the States, as an attempt to sort of find a way forward after this. And what we looked at in Gerrymandering the States was whether or not state legislatures gerrymander themselves. Most state governments are tasked with drawing the congressional maps. They give the state legislature the power to draw the congressional maps. We're seeing this in Virginia right now, for example, and across the country. How do you divide up the congressional maps? But probably few people realize that state governments, state legislatures actually draw their own district maps as well, which presents an obvious conflict of interest. The problem is nobody has really been focusing on state legislative redistricting. There's very little about state legislative redistricting in the literature. And while everybody agrees that the Congress was gerrymandered after the 2010 census, few people had any hard data that this was going on at the state level. So we thought there was a lot of benefits to studying state legislative gerrymandering. One, it could provide us with a more scientifically grounded idea of what actually causes partisan gerrymandering. Believe it or not, within the academic community, there's a debate about why we see this Republican bias across the country. Some people have argued that it's natural because Democrats live in cities and Republicans tend to be more evenly distributed across the country. Some people have argued that that makes it pretty much inevitable that Democrats are going to have a bias against them when it comes to drawing district maps. We push back against this claim quite a bit. And what we really want is a scientifically grounded theory about what actually causes gerrymandering. We couldn't really do this when we looked at congressional gerrymandering in our previous volume, because there are really only 39 states that actually redistrict, that have more than 2 congressional districts. And that sample is too small to conduct a statistical analysis. But when we look at the state legislatures, there are 50 state governments, and there are 99 separate state legislatures within those governments. And each of those has its own map. And so that sample is large enough for us to start conducting a statistical analysis into what actually causes partisan gerrymandering. We also wanted to know what were some of the consequences of gerrymandering. We looked at a variety of outcomes to see that links between the most gerrymandered state governments and the policies that the state governments were adopting after they were gerrymandered. And then lastly, in the last part of the book, we wanted a scientifically grounded assessment of common redistricting forms. All over the country, starting in 2018, we saw a wave of state governments reforming their redistricting processes. And the truth is, we really don't know what the best practices are. And so we hoped with this book, and our hope still is with this book, that this can provide some insight into reformers who would like to change their state laws to change the redistricting processes. So the biggest question that we had to tackle when trying to achieve these goals is, what is gerrymandering and how do you identify it? This strikes at the heart of the Supreme Court's reluctance to tackle the problem of gerrymandering and hear gerrymandering challenges. What exactly is it? Gerrymandering is a word that is casually thrown out by a lot of people. It means a lot of different things. In our volume, what we're looking at is partisan gerrymandering. It's a form of gerrymandering whereby the people who draw the district lines are trying to achieve a political or personal objective. And when you look at the harms caused by gerrymandering, there are quite a few, but there are 3 problematic harms when it comes to democratic norms that we commonly accept. So one democratic norm that is a universal principle is that all votes are treated equally. All citizens are equal in their voice, in their voting power. This is the norm of political equality. So aggressive partisan gerrymandering often violates that norm. So this happened in Virginia in the House of Delegates elections in 2017. Republicans ended up winning control of the House of Delegates, even though the Democrats had more votes. And this is a violation of this norm that all votes should be treated equally, because it really boils down to a majority of voters voting for a certain party should translate to a majority of seats. So that's one harm that gerrymandering often causes, that we think is probably one of the most severe harms. There's other democratic norms that gerrymandering tends to violate, the norm of proportionality, the idea that the seat share that a party wins should be roughly proportionate to the vote share that they received. It's it's pretty accepted, although strict proportionality is perhaps not desirable or not something that is necessarily reformers seek. There's also the norm of responsiveness, that if you have a change in the public will, let's say that in tomorrow's election, Republicans end up getting 10% more votes than they did in the last election. Well, we should see that 10% increase in vote share translated to seat share. The seat share should not be figured out in advance. It should be a product of the vote share. And the way that the standard that we have used to measure the existence of gerrymandering is the partisan symmetry standard. And the partisan symmetry standard basically holds that gerrymandering occurs when the parties are treated differently under different circumstances. When a map is more or less asymmetrical, that benefits one party over another. Let me explain what that means. So this is an example of a district map. Suppose there's like a bunch of districts in a random state where the two parties have about equal support. In a fair districting plan, this is how we would expect the vote share, seat share function to look for party A, the first party. So on the x-axis here, we have the vote percentage for party A, and on the y-axis, we have the seat percentage. And the key here is that if party A ends up getting 50% of the vote, they should have something like 50% of the seat. It should pass through this 0 point, 50-50 point. And likewise, if they get 60% of the vote, they should, maybe they get 70% of the seats, because there is a sort of bonus awarded to the largest party in single member district democracies. Fine, that's fair as long as party B would also get 70% of the seats with 60% of the vote. And so this plan here, we would describe this as an unbiased symmetrical districting plan, because what we see is that party A and party B are treated similarly. This map is rotationally symmetrical when exposed to a variation in terms of possible vote share. This is California's 2011 congressional map, and it looks very similar to that hypothetical map that we showed you. By the way, California, before this redistricting plan was drawn, approved a citizens redistricting initiative that took control of redistricting out of the hands of politicians and gave it to a commission. And this was the first congressional map that they approved. And we would argue that this looks pretty good. It's only slightly biased in favor of Democrats, but by a statistically insignificant margin. And it passes really close to this 50-50 mark. If the Democrats get 70% of the vote, they get about 80% of the seats. And likewise, if the Republicans got 70% of the vote, they would actually get like 90% of the seats. But it's close enough. And it's also responsive. 1% increase in vote share tends to yield a 2% increase in seat share. So that means that the voters change their preferences. The map is actually responsive to those changes. This is what we would call an asymmetric district plan, a plan that's biased to favor one party over another. And so here's a critical difference here. Suppose you have that state where there's a bunch of districts and party A and party B roughly get 50-50 most of the time. In this plan, party A, when they get 50% of the vote, they only get 30% of the seats. And conversely, party B, when they get 50% of the vote, they get like 70% of the seats. And in order to have a 50-50 shot of taking control of the legislature, in this plan, party A needs to get something close to 60% of the vote. They need an overwhelming landslide just to break even. And this, when you look at the histogram as well, it shows you what's going on. What's going on is that you have a lot of districts where party A's vote share is about 40%. It really prevents them from ever winning an equal share of districts. This, by the way, is Pennsylvania's actual 2011 congressional map, and it shows something very similar. When the Democrats win about 50% of the vote, they get like 30% of the seat, and the Republicans are basically guaranteed to stay in a majority, even when they don't win a majority of the votes. There's also like other interesting types of gerrymandering that don't often get a lot of attention. This is New Jersey here. New Jersey it has a slight Democratic advantage, but this is a map where regardless of how the parties perform, because they're always going to perform somewhere between 45 and 55% of the vote, they end up splitting the seats available. And so this is a map that is not necessarily unfair in terms of symmetry. It's still roughly symmetrical. The parties are treated equally, but it is unfair because it's very unresponsive. Voters can change their preferences and the map doesn't award seats any differently. Okay, so this is all theoretical stuff. We had to figure out how to measure the gerrymandering in every single state legislative plan, and that created all sorts of real problems. In order to get a nice vote seat function like this, we needed to have the results of at least one election, or we needed to know what the presidential vote was in every single district. And that was really, really hard. If you look at the sheer scale of the problem, there were over 100 plans that were approved after 2011. Some of them were rejected by a court and new plans were adopted. And not all states, believe it or not, are super transparent about their elections. It was really, really hard to find data in some places. For example, in Mississippi and Alabama, the practices that they use for drawing congressional districts were so convoluted that we had to actually omit them from our book because it was so incredibly complex trying to figure out what the partisan balance of every single state legislative district was. That was a real challenge. There's other places like Georgia, Arkansas, for example, that have an extraordinary number of uncontested elections in their state legislatures. I mean, there are states where more than half of the seats on election day had no challenger contesting that seat because they're essentially drawn to be safe. And that's a tactic that gerrymanderers use to harm the other party. You see this a lot in the South, where Democrats are packed into these seats that have 80%, 90% support, so Republicans don't bother running against them. This creates challenges because in order to create an analysis of a districting plan, we need to have at least one data point. We need to know what the partisan balance is, the two-party level of support is in every single district. In order to solve this problem, one of the things we had to do is we had to take the precinct level presidential vote from 2012 and 2016, and we had to figure that out at every single district level and use a statistical process called imputation to figure out what the partisan balance is. And it took a really long time and it was pretty challenging, but we ended up with at least one election under the districting plans before 2011 and after 2011. And in some cases, every single map, we had two election cycles that we could use. This gave us a way of measuring the scale of partisan gerrymandering in every single state legislature, except Mississippi and Alabama, of course. So like, here's the practical part of writing a book that I think probably people don't realize is that like the writing of the book, that was really easy. Much of that was like maybe less than a year of actually, once the results were ready, it was a very quick process of writing it up and there it is. But actually getting to the point where we could run any sort of analysis, just collecting the data took like 2 years in and of itself. And that's one of the challenges that researchers often face is getting the data and cleaning the data and just interpreting your data analysis. That's a lot of time. It's sort of like an iceberg where the part that you see, it doesn't look very big, but there's the part of the iceberg that's underwater. That's the largest part of the iceberg. And that's sort of like my experience with this particular project. Okay, so let's return to the first research question. What actually happened after 2011 redistricting. For the first time, we were able to provide definitive systematic evidence by looking at every single map except those in Mississippi and Alabama. And we found that nearly half of the maps in our sample had evidence of extreme partisan gerrymandering. And overwhelmingly, this bias favored the Republican Party. And Democrats, we found two examples, two maps where Democrats gave themselves an advantage. But overwhelmingly, 43 out of the 45 maps that we flagged as having extreme partisan gerrymandering favored the Republican Party. It is the extent of bias at the state legislative level that favors the Republicans is such that in your average state legislative chamber, Republicans have like a 9% advantage. They're already they're already insulated by this buffer. And here you can see the distribution of bias on these histograms. The one on the left is before 2011. The one on the right is after 2011. And it kind of tells a little story about what happened. So before redistricting, you already had bias that favored the Republicans in the plan. It was a little bit of bias. It wasn't extreme bias, but most of the plans were somewhere, more than less than zero, and negative numbers here represent gerrymandering in favor of the Republicans, but they were less than 10 here. But after redistricting, what we saw is an increase on the extremes, an increase in the number of plans that had more than 20% asymmetry levels, more than 30% asymmetry levels, or even more than 40% asymmetry levels, extreme partisan gerrymandering. And so this tells us a lot about what went on. It's very clear that the maps were redrawn to give Republicans an extreme advantage. And by the way, I'm not picking on Republicans. We did not approach this with a partisan lens. We're just running the data and analyzing the data. And the data speaks for itself in this regard. So what actually causes gerrymandering? This was like the second goal of the book, answering this question, because now we have this large sample size and we're able to do all sorts of statistical analysis, large and statistical analysis. But the answer ends up being really, really simple. It's politics. When politicians are drawing the maps, they rig the maps in their party's favor. It's not surprising. We found that the overwhelming majority of cases could be explained by politics. So the key is that when a party has the motive and the opportunity to gerrymander, it will gerrymander. And this happened in a number of instances. And I'm sorry, this is kind of tacky that I took a screenshot of the proof pages of the book because I don't actually have a PDF of the book and I lost table 3.4. So apologize for that distracting proof thing in the background. But this is a table that's right out of the book. And it shows that the hypothesis of when we expect to see gerrymandering is pretty much borne out by the data. You see a bunch of biased maps when one party drew the maps without the help of another party, and when it had an incentive to do so. But here's the more interesting thing. There's more to this story that hasn't really been told, and it has a lot to do with the geography of race in the United States. One of the things we were able to look at systematically that we couldn't look at when we were looking at Congress was how race, the geography of race, contributed to the level of gerrymandering that we saw. And what we found is quite shocking, but it makes a lot of sense. So imagine that you are a Republican and you want to harm the Democrats. How do you do this? Well, if you look at our state, a state like Virginia, our state, the geography of our states reflects the legacy of slavery, as do a lot of Southern states, and Midwestern states reflect high degrees of racial segregation as well. What we have in Virginia is, white people live throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. They're clustered in high concentrations in Appalachia, of course, not surprising. But when we look at Black people are clustered in parts of Southern Virginia, but they're also in areas like Northern Virginia in the inner suburbs of Washington, D.C., and Central Virginia around Richmond, Petersburg, and in the Hampton Roads area as well. And Virginia has elements of racial segregation, and this sort of sheds light on segregation in Virginia. But it turns out that Republicans are able to use segregation to their advantage because Black voters and Hispanic Latino voters tend to support Democrats. Republicans can hurt Democrats by packing Black voters into these majority district lines. And so the way they're able to do this is you look for Black neighborhoods and you basically draw district lines around Black neighborhoods. And this creates districts that are majority Black, which is excellent for representation, but they end up diluting the voting power of African-American communities by packing African-American residents into these districts with like 70% Black populations, when you could have two districts that had like maybe 45% Black population, and they would probably elect more Black legislatures. But Republicans, seeing the correlation between race and partisanship, simply target African Americans. They draw nice compact district lines around African American communities. It ends up diluting the voting power of Black Americans and Latinx communities. And they're able to harm Democrats by doing this. This is just the example of Virginia, and this is borne out if you were to look at the racial gerrymandering cases here in Virginia. In 2019, the federal courts overturned a racial gerrymander that probably a lot of you remember, the House of Delegates. It happened in Congress as well. And what's striking is how the Democrats fared after those racist district maps were overturned by the court. So this is the 2012 map in Virginia. And I can't remember the partisan breakdown. It was, I think Virginia Democrats actually had a majority, but I might be mistaken. It was very close either way. And here it ended up that Democrats only ended up winning 3 out of the 11 seats up for grabs in Virginia, even though Democrats had close to 50% of the vote. Clearly a gerrymander, and if you look at the lines, this district in particular is meant to connect as many Black neighborhoods as possible so that Black Americans in Central and Eastern Virginia wouldn't have the opportunity to elect 2 members of color to Congress. But after the federal court redraws the district maps and the 2012 election takes place, you see a dramatic change. Once those district lines are redrawn by a court, Democrats end up taking most of the districts, and you have more people of color being elected. So it's pretty overwhelming. Virginia is just one state. In one of the chapters of the book, we applied this analysis to all of the states, all 48 states in our sample. And this is what we found. So when we looked at the level of racial segregation at the precinct level, we found a very high correlation with the level of Republican gerrymandering. So in other words, the more segregated a state was, the more gerrymandering we saw. But that correlation only existed in the maps that were drawn by the Republican Party. Once you take away all of the maps drawn by the Republican Party, we saw no statistically significant relationship between the two. So in other words, even in democratically controlled states where there's high degrees of segregation, the map drawers were able to overcome that segregation, and they still managed to draw maps that did not give one party an advantage. When the Republicans drew the maps, they used segregation to help their party win more seats. And they did this by wasting the votes of Black and Latino voters. The same thing applies when we look at Latinx white segregation. The same rule applies. So this gives you some insight into the brain of a Republican gerrymander. How do they actually control redistricting? How do they use that to give themselves an advantage? It's very clear. You go after communities of color and you dilute their voting power, and you end up winning more seats as a result of it. In a few cases, the Supreme Court or a federal court ended up redrawing these district lines because plaintiffs were able to prove to the courts that this was racial gerrymandering that's prohibited by the Constitution. But in most cases, we would posit that actually didn't happen. So this is something to look for during the next redistricting cycle. So as another part of our book, we wanted to know how does gerrymandering affect policies that states produce? And we ended up looking at a lot of different policies. This chapter was mainly authored by Michael Latner, and I'm sorry he can't be here today because this is really something that he's very knowledgeable about, but I think I can present a little bit about this. One of the things that we looked at as a benchmark for policy outcomes after 2012 was the infant mortality rate. So infant mortality rate is a standard metric when you're comparing public health systems. And one of the most striking things that we saw when we looked at the correlation between gerrymandering and infant mortality was that gerrymandering explains very little about disparities between communities. It's clear that there is structural racism in public health because regardless of who is controlling state government, what you see is that the infant mortality rate in Black communities is more than double in some instances what it is in white communities. And so this tells us that, if gerrymandering plays a role, it's much smaller, and that there is a much bigger issue going on that gerrymandering has very little to do, and that is structural racism in medicine. But in any case, there are still some interesting insights that we can take from gerrymandering. What we see is that in the states that are run by Democrats, where Democrats controlled state government, you see infant mortality rates are at least lower, relatively speaking, among Black mothers. When we see when we look at Republican states, we unsurprisingly see higher levels of infant mortality, but the highest levels that we observe occur in Republican states that were extremely gerrymandered. And so the same thing occurs when we look at actions taken by a state, challenging the Affordable Care Act in court, for example, or passing restrictive abortion laws. We see the same pattern. Republican-controlled states were much more likely to challenge the Affordable Care Act or pass like fetal heartbeat abortion bans, for example, but they are less likely than extreme Republican gerrymandered states. So we see real policy outcomes as a result of gerrymandering. And the reason that we suspect this is going on is because at the state level, gerrymandering isn't about giving the Republicans control. It isn't simply about that. It's giving them this veto-proof majority control, where you have a super majority control. In Wisconsin, for instance, even though the Republicans win less than 50% of the vote in 2020, they still have 2/3 of the seats in the General Assembly, and they can basically pass whatever they want over the veto of the Democratic governor. And that's what we think is going on. We also looked, we had this extraordinary timing, right? When we were finishing the manuscript, you had this global pandemic. And we were able to look at how the states responded to the pandemic in terms of laws that they passed. And again, we see that extremely gerrymandered states were less likely to respond to COVID-19 with mask mandates and that sort of thing. And likewise, the problem with gerrymandering at the state level is that the states administer their own elections and they administer the elections for Congress. And what we see is that voting becomes harder after 2012 in states with extreme partisan gerrymandering. And this ends up having ripple effects, because if you make voting harder, then it's even harder for the gerrymandered party that's gerrymandered out of power to ever win back power. And we also saw that in the run-up to 2020, the most extremely gerrymandered states were much less accommodating to in their election response in the context of COVID. So all of these policy outcomes sort of reveal one of the harms of gerrymandering that isn't really talked about, that isn't really researched, and that is how it affects the real quality of life that citizens have in a state. the most gerrymandered state governments are able to win regardless of what the public wants, regardless of public opinion. And they're basically able, they use this power to pass policy that is controversial, that ends up affecting the quality of life in very real, tangible ways. So as the last part of our book, one of the questions we wanted to shed light on was redistricting reforms and whether those types of reforms actually work. We have a robust public debate going on right now about the efficacy of redistricting reform. And the truth is, there isn't a lot of evidence out there. There is a lot of speculation. There is a lot of fashionable reforms that people tout, but we don't really know what works and what doesn't. Our analysis of the state governments gave us a window into the efficacy of various reforms. And so we were able to look at reforms and see what works and what doesn't work and what reformers should be focusing on. So when you look at all of the ways that states can change their redistricting processes, we divide this into two categories. There's rules, and rules are designed to basically ensure a certain outcome by tying the hands of the redistrictors by saying, you have to pass a map that has these features, or you're not allowed to pass a map that has these features. We see all sorts of redistricting rules in states where the state legislature draws the maps and in states where an independent commission draws the maps. One of the most common rules is compactness in the Virginia Constitution. This was written in our most recent Virginia Constitution in the 1970s. It says essentially that all districts have to be compact. Almost every single state has similar language in their constitution that requires some level of compactness. There's also some states that ban political favoritism or that require maps to make elections competitive, or maps that preserve communities or county lines or whatever. When we looked at all of these rules, we tried to find a connection between the rules and the level of gerrymandering, and we found nothing. Compactness laws are essentially ineffective. They don't actually impact the level of compactness in a district map, the average compactness. We used a variety of compactness measures and we found no correlation. If anything, they actually end up leading to more gerrymandering the more compact a district map is, for the reasons that we saw on previous slides, because people of color tend to be harmed when map makers draw compact districts around minority communities. And in some cases, compactness is actually really, really bad for ensuring a fair map. But we found no statistical link between compactness laws and gerrymandering. And likewise with political favoritism, one of the problems with these types of rules are that they're pretty much impossible to enforce. And in fact, enforcing these rules relies on the state level courts. And the state level courts aren't really good at detecting violations of these types of rules because the courts aren't experts and there aren't very clear standards for identifying violations in these rules. And so one of the things we argue is that redistricting rules really don't work. You can write a rule into the law, into a state statute or a constitution that requires a certain outcome. And if the process is fundamentally unfair, then you're not going to see any effect. And one of the things that we see time and time again is that political actors in the legislature, they have these rules and they just ignore them. They don't follow the rules. And there's really no way to make them follow the rules. And even if a court is able to strike down the maps and implement new maps, it isn't until several election cycles have already occurred, meaning that they got away with it essentially. But what we found compelling evidence to support is that changing the process to be more inclusive and more specifically to remove politicians from the process actually leads to a significant reductions in gerrymandering. So we found, for example, that independent redistricting, and we define that as redistricting commissions that have no politicians seated on them, leads to close to 8% reduction in gerrymandering bias. And that's very real. I mean, so you can imagine going from a state where one party in the legislature was drawing the maps to a state where no politicians are involved at all, you're almost eliminating gerrymandering altogether, partisan gerrymandering at least. And this little graph shows you why control of the map matters. So when Republicans are in control, the x-axis here shows you the level of gerrymandering in the previous plan, and the y-axis shows you the level of gerrymandering in the new plan. What we see is that regardless of what the old plan looked like, when Republicans are drawing the lines, they end up becoming very much gerrymandered in favor of the Republicans. But when an independent body like a judge or a citizens commission was drawing the maps, you see actual substantive changes. Most of the plans ended up becoming reduced in the level of gerrymandering. And the reason is because citizens and judges don't approach redistricting from the same mindset that politicians do. They approach it from a very different perspective. And so we argue that independent redistricting, truly independent redistricting, is going to bring you a marked reduction in partisan gerrymandering. But it's also worth pointing out that if we really want to eliminate redistricting, what we need to adopt is proportional representation. We need to follow the rest of the world and adopt true proportional representation. And we can do that in a number of ways. We can do this by having each state sort of serve as a district in and of itself, a single district, and everybody casts one vote for their favorite candidate, and the top 100 candidates advance, for example, if there's 100 seats in the assembly. Or you can adopt multi-member districts. You know, one of the things I've thought about is splitting Virginia into like 4 or 5 separate regions: Northern Virginia, Central Virginia, Tidewater, Southern Virginia, and Appalachia, for example, and giving each region a pot of seats that's proportionate to the population of that region, and you treating each region as like a multi-member district. So you go and you cast a single vote for your favorite candidate, and that would ensure diversity in terms of race and language communities, but it would also it would make it more viable for third-party candidates to get elected. But we're nowhere near that reform, and there isn't sort of like the public appetite for that type of reform right now. And so I'm going to close by just looking at what's happening in Virginia right now. In Virginia, we adopted redistricting reform, but what we did was we sort of went halfway. The legislature drew the maps the previous round, and after an enormous 6-year campaign of pressuring the General Assembly, the politicians in the General Assembly agreed to create a redistricting commission, but they still gave themselves 8 seats on the 16-member commission. And so what we've seen in the last 2 weeks is the commission essentially broke down, and there's partisan bickering, and they were unable to approve a map. And so now the process is going to be drawn by the Supreme Court. Our book suggests that is a very good thing, because the Supreme Court is not staffed by politicians. Members of the Virginia Supreme Court don't actually run for re-election, and there are good reasons to believe that this will result in a map that has much less partisan gerrymandering than the map we saw last time. Okay, I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to turn it over to anyone who has questions, because I've been talking for a long time. And so I will take a look at the Q&A to see if anybody has any questions. Yeah. Or if you do have questions, you can feel free to ask now. And if there were any questions in advance of the event, I can answer those as well.
We don't have any questions, but I see one in here. And I just wanted to say before we get started that one of the advantages of doing a virtual event is that you can actually look up etymology of words, look up things up as the speakers present. So I didn't grow up in the United States, so a lot of the terms are still quite interesting to me to discover, such as gerrymandering. So for those of you out there who, like me, don't know where the term originates, here's your etymology lesson. It comes from the early 19th century from the name of Governor Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, plus the combination of salamander, from the supposed similarity between a salamander and the shape of a new voting district on a map drawn when he was in office in 1812, the creation of which was felt to favor his party. And the map with claws, wings, and fangs added was published in Boston's Weekly Messenger with the title, The Gerrymander. So after this, after this definition, let's go to Arthur Palmer. And by the way, those of you who'd like to ask questions live, you can also raise your hands and I'll be happy to unmute you. So Arthur Palmer, did you look at or find any benefits of gerrymandering? For example, perhaps acting as a damper against extreme swings in public opinion? And the second part of the question, have you looked at the history prior to 2011 when it began, why it began, how it has evolved over time? Thank you, Arthur.
So that's a really interesting question, Arthur. Here's the problem. There are two sides to every coin. And one of the benefits that we see in the most extreme Republican gerrymandered states is that gerrymandering tends to promote the representation of Black and Latinx communities. And so in the most gerrymandered states, you tend to see more people of color serving in the legislature than in states that aren't extremely gerrymandered. However, there's a caveat. The people who are elected to those districts are often completely left out of the governing coalition. Their voices are not taken seriously in the legislature. And it creates additional concerns for reform because when there's pressure to reform those particular states, the people who are elected to those seats, those safe districts, they don't want to change the system because they get elected every single time. And their community votes for them and they're happy with the arrangement as it is. It works for their political career. So there is an incentive. And in some cases, you see Democrats joining Republicans to support a veto-proof majority because it helps their individual interests. But I think like the big picture is that rather than thinking of gerrymandering as an outcome of a map, it's better to think of gerrymandering as the process. And gerrymandering happens when the process is exclusive, when the process is limited to just a couple of voices and a couple of perspectives, when one party can dominate the process without any accountability, without any transparency, and basically pass whatever they want, that's bad. And so I would argue that it's better to have a process that is more inclusive to more voices, even if we can't really predict the exact outcomes of what the map will look like in the end. It will be better because the process was more fair. Have I looked at the history before 2011 and when it began? It's been going on for hundreds of years. Even before the United States, you had redistricting bias before the term gerrymander was even coined. In Great Britain, for example, you had rotten boroughs. And what that would look like is you'd have a district in London, for example, that was limited to a single estate. And it was a way of ensuring that wealthy people had power in the House of Commons. And it was essentially given the representation of an entire city. So this single estate might wield this incredible political power, but you'd have these vast disparities in population between districts. That's another form of gerrymandering. And in fact, we've seen that type of gerrymandering throughout American history as a way of diluting the voting power of urban residents and giving rural residents more power. Before the 1960s, for example, states didn't even redraw their district lines. And so there were some districts, for instance, in Tennessee, that had a population that was like 1/10 of a neighboring population. So you might have an urban district that has a population size that's like 10 times the size of a neighboring district that's in the countryside. And this reflects like one of the central conflicts in American history between the rural interests and the urban interests. And that tension is sort of reflected in different forms of gerrymandering that we've seen. But that's a very good question.
And thank you so much for your answer, Alex. We're going to Bob Downs' question. He starts, some have suggested that uncapping the House of Representatives would help with the gerrymandering problem. But your data on state level gerrymandering suggests that the problem would persist even with more or with smaller districts. How do you respond to that?
But Bob, that is a really, really interesting point. I think there are a lot of good reasons to uncap the House of Representatives. I wrote about that in my dissertation that probably nobody's ever read before, but but there are good reasons to increase the number of legislatures in Congress. It creates better representation. People are more likely to know who their member of Congress is. It might reduce the effect of money in politics as well. It may be a very weak correlation between the number of districts up for grabs and gerrymandering, but it won't stop gerrymandering. An example, if you look at New Hampshire is like one of the smallest states in the country, and it has like something like 400 members in its House of Representatives, or its lower house. Yet you still see bias, and I want to see, I think that I might actually have data on this, maybe not, but the level of bias it's much less than some of the most extreme gerrymandered states, but it's still possible to draw bias even when there's low level. So the thing is, this is not a mechanical effect. If a politician is in charge of the process, even if there's 1,000 districts, they're still going to be able to draw as much bias as possible, although there might be some constraints of having more districts. So I would be completely in favor of expanding the House of Representatives, or even the Virginia House of Delegates. And it might have a very, very modest effect of preventing the most extreme gerrymandering, but that's not going to solve gerrymandering in and of itself.
Thank you for that. And Bob also has a follow-up question. Is it racial gerrymandering if the redistricting is done using past election results rather than strictly using, I guess he means the category of race?
Yeah, so that's a delicate balance. This has been a long-running dialogue between the U.S. Congress and the Supreme Court over what is the appropriate use of race when drawing district lines. And it's a long story, but the short story is that it doesn't really matter if a state government intended to use race. If a districting map harms members of a race minority community, then that's a violation of the Voting Rights Act, essentially. That's a violation of the 14th Amendment. And so it doesn't really matter, the intent here doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what data they're using. The truth is, all that matters is that it harms a community, a historically marginalized community. But the law is far from settled. Over the last decade, you saw the Supreme Court being a lot more aggressive in overturning racial gerrymandering cases. But now we have 3 new justices on the bench. And so those justices were appointed by President Trump. They're likely to be much more conservative. So we don't know how they're going to respond to future racial gerrymandering cases. The truth is, the law is not fixed, and it's just a reflection of who's sitting on the court at the time. I'm sorry if I'm a little bit cynical when it comes to that. All right, so Bob, you have another question that I'm happy to answer as well, because there aren't any other questions. Will your statistical analysis be able to be applied to the maps proposed by the 2 partisan consultants the Virginia Supreme Court will use before the final decision is rendered? Yes, it will. If they ask me, I will gladly apply my own method, our method, to the maps. However, I think that they probably have their own approach for measuring gerrymandering or measuring partisan advantage. There are a lot of problems with some of the alternative methods that probably is beyond the scope of this particular forum, but I will certainly be looking at that when it comes out anxiously and evaluating the maps myself.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you all for your comments and questions. Perfect timing. I realize we compete with the faculty club, which just started an hour ago, and our colleagues who have received tenure or promotion in the last year are being honored. So thanks so much to all of you who are sticking around. And before we leave today, I just wanted to just say a few words about other things coming up at the HRC very briefly. So our next event in the Meet VC Author Series will be 2 weeks from today on November the 15th with Dr. Kim Case, Director of Faculty Success at the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence in the Office of the Provost, who will be in dialogue with Dr. Selina Brody, Professor of Psychology and Assistant Dean for Equity, Justice, and Inclusion at the University of Texas at Dallas. Dr. Case and Dr. Brody will speak about their recent book called Navigating Difficult Moments in Teaching Diversity and Social Justice. Also in November 1st is today, right? We have 2 great events to kick off the Native American Heritage Month on November the 11th, which is next Thursday at 6 p.m. We will welcome virtually Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz from California, who will speak to us about her most recent book titled Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and the History of Erasure and Exclusion. On November the 18th, we'll all welcome both in person and virtually Choctaw writer and UGA Eidson Distinguished Professor Lian Howe, who will read from her recent book, Savage Conversations. I look forward to seeing many of you and your students at these events, and many thanks to you all for supporting the HRC. Once again, Professor Keena, congratulations. Any final parting words?
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, don't forget to vote tomorrow.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful week. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, my pleasure.